a lot of young women are being forced into relationships with gang members and sexually abused. If you're in a situation where your family is facing these types of obstacles and you don't have a choice really to stay.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice Blom, and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen. Okay, good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest, who's actually a colleague of mine, but he will introduce himself. No, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi everybody. Noel Andersen, he is him. I am the National Field Director for the advocacy team at Church World Service. I also lead the National Collaborative on Immigration with the United Church of Christ, which is the denomination of which I'm ordained in.
Okay. And Noel, before I'm going to ask you, how did you get into, how did you become a referent and into this work? Tell us, where were you born and were you also raised there?
Well, actually, I was born in Orange, California, Southern California. And at the time, my dad was serving as a Methodist pastor, an associate pastor, but my uncle was the superintendent of a Methodist church out in Wisconsin. And my dad, being from the Midwest, wanted to go out there. And it wasn't very long before the need to come back to sunny California, maybe more on my mom's side, took over. And we really ended up, because of my dad's job, moving around a lot. So Northern California is really where I was raised, but I have lots of stories of living abroad and living in different states, Arizona, living in Washington, D.C. So definitely have been a bit of a vagabond myself.
So your dad was also stationed outside of the U.S. Do I understand it correctly, or not?
No, that was more from my background.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So he was always in California, and then he ended up teaching a religion in Oregon at a community college. But that was after he finished ministry. Unfortunately, passed away in 2013. But yeah, I mean, that definitely is rooted, I think, in my story, because and how I got involved in this work. Moving from town to town, a lot of the times my first friends were kids of immigrants, because we were in rural spaces, and there was a lot of farm working in those areas. And so usually the community I found that welcomed me most was, of course, our faith community and the immigrant community, actually. Even though, my background is more, both my parents are white, they also raised me, though, with these values of welcome. My mom was a special ed teacher. And so this idea that, everybody should be welcome regardless of their background was something instilled into me at a young age. And when I went on to study, cultural anthropology, and then ended up doing an abroad program when I was at the University California, Santa Cruz, I went to Mexico, and then later ended up coming back to do more central projects with different nonprofits in Central America, tied to my field study at the Pacific School of Religion. And it really was the moments in the communities that I think shaped me the most. I remember there was a time where a family had befriended us. We were strangers in Mexico, and and we all became friends. But one of the elders, one of the grandmas said, "You see here, we treat you like family. Why is it that when we come to your country, we're treated so poorly, like second class citizens?" And of course, at the time, I didn't have the answer, but the answer is rooted in the history of colonialism, the history of racism that we face in this country and throughout the globe. And for me as well, when I in my field study at seminary, I learned from in El Salvador about the liberation theology and Oscar Romero and the revolution that many of the community workers had been involved in at that time in the 1980s. And that's really where I found myself uh, getting very interested in the sanctuary movement, working with congregations that had been involved with that still had ties to Central America, and ended up, that becoming a big part of my work, both community organizing and the sanctuary movement work, which I'm sure we'll be talking more about today.
Yeah, no, I'm absolutely interested in that, but I would like to go a few steps back, because when you grew up, okay, you were, what you told us is that, exposed to a lot of the immigrant story, and that, was definitely of influence. Do you have an anecdote or a story about, you, your upbringing, when you were still a child? Yes, we understand you moved from one town to another, but which story would you tell of something that something significant that happened, or that is telling?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of snippets of small stories that add
Mm-hmm.
up. Like I remember being in a new school, which was common for me, and not knowing anybody. I was
Mm,
about 8 years old, and the I was kind of sitting there on the bench, shy, scared to talk to other people. And first day of school, and somebody came up to me, and of course I was young, so I can't tell you exactly his background, but uh, came from a Latinx family for sure, and um, you know, was able to welcome me to go play a game of handball, and so I remember that feeling, right? The feeling
mm,
of being alone, the feeling of not knowing anybody, and then that feeling when somebody actually extends a hand out to you. And similar. It's interesting, the similar stories throughout my moving from different school to different schools, and that's where I first started wanting to learn Spanish, and ended up becoming fluent in Spanish, um, and I think also where I didn't know it at the time, but also met a lot of challenges around the race dynamics at a young age. Like, people asking me if I wanted to be a gang banger because I was hanging out with Latino kids,
mm,
or one of my, a lot of people referring to a black friend of mine in different uh, derogatory terms,
mm,
and going to like a very diverse high school where there were actually refugees, like Hmong refugees, a lot of uh, people from different religious backgrounds, a lot of
mhm,
Sikh, and learning to negotiate those differences at a young age, and trying to figure out what was the value of diversity, all in the midst of also being rural spaces where people had pickup trucks with Confederate flags that
mm,
flew. So, a lot of people think in California, they think of like the, the surfing and LA area, but where I grew up was more like Oklahoma. And
mm,
in fact, a lot of descendants from the Oklahoma Dust Bowlers. And, uh, you know, that was a place when I was being raised that was also changing
mm,
significantly, because California was changing, and now is one of the states that has the majority is minority population, and I think white population is somewhere around 30%.
Now, is that also then the reason that, when the time is that you have to choose a study, that you choose anthropology? Because you're exposed to different culture and then you're somehow fascinated by that, or?
Oh yeah, I think completely that's part of it. And also, I think my familial upbringing, my
Hmm.
dad um was, I think, always supportive to, like, I remember doing things like choir sessions with the African American Episcopal church and our Methodist church. We would come together for certain events.
Hmm.
My aunt actually did her Peace Corps in Africa, and so my uncle was an asylum seeker, asylee actually, from Burundi. And so growing up with cousins that were half Burundian, and that to me always really shaped me. And I think, when you think back to the 70s when
Hmm.
my aunt got married, that was something that was still very new to have interracial marriages like that. And I think that really shaped me too, in terms of
Hmm.
now I'm also in an interracial marriage. My wife's family comes from a Sri Lankan background, and her parents had essentially fled the Civil War. They didn't come on a refugee status. They came through a family immigration connection, but that's why they fled
Hmm.
Sri Lanka in the 1983, after Black July. And my mother-in-law's house where she was living at the time was burned down because of an inter-ethnic marriage, or an interreligious marriage of
Hmm.
Tamil Sinhalese. So it's kind of, to me, it's fascinating to think back about how the influences I had as a young person, and even in my family, also shaped not only my work life but also my personal life. And the it's been very important for me to be part of an immigrant family. And uh they've been, once again, I find that, maybe at first it was a little difficult, but they really welcomed me in
Hmm.
and have been very supportive to me and my children. And that's meant the world to me.
Hmm. Um, so you study cultural anthropology, which is the same as I did. So that's
Oh yeah, that's right, I forgot we had the same
yeah.
major.
So that's really interesting. But you then decide to to get ordained. So following your dad, what did that play a role, or how did that go?
Yeah, it most definitely played a huge role. I think, I'm fourth generation pastor. I went from
Hmm.
Methodist though to United
Hmm.
Church of Christ
How was
because
that for your? So how was that in the family?
they were fine with it. I think we're cousins, so
Hmm.
it's sort of all in the family of the ecumenical
Hmm.
spaces. And for me, it was just, I was also very interested in doing a type of ministry that's known as, extensional, or in this case, in the UCC, a four-way covenant,
Hmm.
where I have a relationship with a local church as well as the conference and the national church and an agency such as Church World Service. And doing that, faith community organizing, refugee community organizing is the type of work I've always been very interested in. Of course, I love parish work too, but it is nice not to have to always work on Sundays, I can tell you. But I think for me, the faith part of the work has always been so foundational. I don't think that I'm not sure that I would care about the issues that I work on if it wasn't for the way I was raised, in that, you know, we are called to love our neighbor. And we all have been excluded and we all have been welcomed. And those foundational values, I think, really shaped who I was. And I think leaning on God in my hardest times in life really developed my faith and made me want to think about what does it mean for a person of faith. Maybe I do come from a relative place of privilege. I mean, not that my family always had a lot of money, but I'm a white male in a society where those privileges are much easier in a systemic level for people of that demographic. And a lot of people ask me, well, why would you care about immigrants and refugees? And so, yeah, I mean, I think some of the stories I've told about the relationships I've built, the stories I've heard, the impacted leaders who have shared with me and become friends of mine or family members of mine. All of those things have shaped me, and I also think that for me, the faith values of caring about communities that have been systemically oppressed and doing something accompanying alongside people in their struggle for systemic change, social change. It has been instrumental to who I am and what my faith is about. And that's why I think for me, studying about the leaders who have been part of the liberation work from a faith perspective, like I mentioned, Archbishop Bosco Romero, certainly, Martin Luther King. I mean, I know my dad wrote his thesis on Dr. King, and there are so many, right, leaders that don't have books about them, but have been tremendously influential in trying to bend that arc of justice. And so I think for me, that's why I went into the work of ministry and wanting to work with the faith communities, is because it had been so influential to me and who I am. And why I ended up working with Church World Service and the United Church of Christ as well is because they're organizations that do the work from that faith lens, but also in a way that, I think particularly when we're working with refugees, we do that in a way where we're not trying to proselytize or use our privilege in ways that would also perpetuate the systems of injustice. And so, that type of progressive Christianity, you might call it, as well as with the United Church of Christ being such a leader on LGBTQ issues, those things have all appealed to me and what I want my life to be about.
So after your finish your study, you're ordained now. How did you then get involved with CWS, and then also tell about your work with UCC? And how many years ago was that?
Yeah, well, good question. So, I mean, for me, Church World Service has always been in the ethos that I grew up with. Being one of the denominational members, always hearing about Church World Service's work, in community, a lot of it in our international work, but disaster relief. And, my work around immigration had, in a lot of ways, cascaded from one area to the next. And in the Bay Area, I was working on a living wage campaign with some unions, and that was mainly, the immigrant workers that were impacted. And when I had lived and worked and done different ministries with the Methodists, actually in Central America and Honduras, um, around housing projects, and had also done work with the Share Foundation that I got to know through when I was at Pacific School of Religion. And so I worked with them as part of my internship, and worked with the Comunidades Rurales para el Desarrollo de El Salvador, which is the rural communities for development in El Salvador. And so it was a lot around actually resettled communities who had been displaced during the Civil War to Honduras. And then when they were able to finally come back, were given a piece of land, but it was usually not the greatest piece of land and not developed. And so a lot of our community organizing work was around community development. And so really getting to understand the root causes of migration, even in those times, which was more in 2006, there were a lot of people leaving to migrate. And so a lot of the brain drain and, you know, it may have been a lot of economic migration at that point, but already was starting the violence and the gang violence to really make an impact in driving migration. And we've seen that to be a continued pattern. So, in my sort of traveling on the bus all the way from Guatemala up to the U.S. border, getting to understand the migrant's journey a bit in that time, which was a long time ago now. And so I just had this sense that I was called to the border, and so I went to Arizona and I worked with Border Links that says education on about the U.S. border for church groups, university groups, and then from there, I was actually recruited from a UCC pastor, Reverend Randy Mayer, the Good Shepherd UCC, and he helped me get through the ordination process. And he also founded the Green Valley Samaritan group, amongst with others, around putting water out in the desert. So, when you ask that question of 100 miles, to me, I think about out there in the desert, putting water out in the desert and helping with humanitarian aid for migrants in the desert, because unfortunately, I think there's been somewhere around 7 or 8,000 remains found. And we estimate many more people who have never been found have died on the U.S. Mexico border because of migration, which is really a humanitarian crisis. And now we're receiving even higher numbers than that in the Mediterranean Sea. And the same type of militarization of the border happening really across the globe now in the global south to global north migration patterns. And so for me, that was something I knew I wanted to continue working. And I was at the Good Shepherd when Senate Bill 1070 in Arizona came through. And that was an anti-immigrant bill. It was like a show me your papers type of bill that would promote racial profiling. And so we launched a faith community organizing campaign against that bill. And I was doing all the organizing on a volunteer level because I had such a supportive boss, Randy Mayer. And so actually, that's where I was with some other colleagues. We got a grant through Church World Service, micro grant, to do an interfaith rally around the issues. And we brought in the theologian Miguel de la Torre, who's at ILIF now. And that really, helped me connect with the advocacy office at Church World Service, who at the time was Jen Smyer. So this was 2010. And so, getting to see what was the advocacy office doing, what were the action alerts happening. And I went to one of their workshops they put on in Arizona that in collaboration with Auburn Seminary at Southside Presbyterian Church. And so when I saw the position open up for grassroots coordinator for immigrants' rights at the time, designed for faith communities, I applied and I was hired. And at that time, it was just Jen and I. And so we've really built the team up in the 9 years we worked together to about 15 staff, 7 or 8 organizers, and 5 or 6 different policy folk, regional organizers. And so continue to do that work now.
And now if you look back at all those years and what's going on now, How do you feel? Do you think, we have been able to make progress, or has the situation, did it get worse? Did it get better, or is it just different? Um,
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we look at the patterns of migration, we see shifts happening as we
mhm,
speak. And whereas traditionally a lot of migrants, and we see this that if we go back to like the Bracero program, right, where people came in, they worked underneath the guest worker program, and went back, and then those patterns kind of continued for decades later, and until we started really militarizing the border, and then it was like very much after 1996, very a lot more difficult to go back and forth, and so people started staying, and so you had these larger
mm,
populations of undocumented people, and we thought we were going to get some kind of pathway to citizenship for people. And I think we were quite close a few different times, and really what has now it seems politically not viable because of the influx of migrants at the border. And so we've really seen an increase of unaccompanied children at the border, an increase of populations from throughout the world at the border, from Africa, from the Middle East, um, from Haiti. And I think that there is this question about the state of democracy globally and in our own country.
mhm,
And we have seen the political destabilization really significantly raise the number of refugees, the number of displaced people. I think it's 110 million now, UNHCR says, of displaced people and refugees. And now we've seen that there's been this uh, climate climate change is really a driver
mhm,
of migration. And really, this is not new. When I think about what was happening in Central America when I was living there, there were a lot of hurricanes, mudslides. And at the time, we didn't recognize that those intense hurricanes, there'd always been hurricanes that came through, but these were
mhm,
different levels. The disaster was more significant, and the recovery was very difficult for those countries, and that's why a lot of people were able to get to temporary protected status from those disasters. But mean, are things better or worse? I mean, I think globally there is an increase of political destabilization that has and that the reality around migration and forced migration is only going to grow.
mm,
That's I think that the problem I see though is the way that governments have been responding from this sort of nationalist or white supremacist perspective of trying to limit that rather than understanding that, particularly in this country, that is the roots of this country in the US. But also, I think that we do have the capacity to
mm,
absorb the amount of asylum seekers and refugees that are coming. It's really that we haven't decided to put the funds and welcome infrastructure in place.
mhm,
And so I think, the policies that of nativism or restrictionism of of immigration has only caused these human trafficker cartels to increase more. We've seen a huge increase of kidnappings and extortion, and then
mhm,
there's a lot of violence and rape that comes with that, which is just horrific to see. And, I think we see what's happening now with Ukraine and in Palestine and Gaza, and that these wars are really destabilizing. The war in Syria has been very destabilizing and to the entire regions. And so, is it getting better? I mean, I suppose that you might think about what metrics. If we're talking about migration, it seems as though things are getting more complicated, more difficult.
mm,
But I know that you had referenced in your notes the sustainability goals.
mhm,
And so, in some regards, it seems like we have made progress on a lot of things like fighting poverty, on a lot of things like gender equity,
Mm.
and a lot of we're raising a lot more awareness around climate change, and there's a lot more climate action than there was in the past. We see that in the global north, the LGBTQ equity has really gained prominence, although we have a lot of ways to go in many countries. Some countries have made it illegal. We are seeing like a greater conversation around the need to stop racism and the need for racial equity. And so in some regards, we've come a long way.
Mm-hmm.
In immigration domestically is more my expertise. Um, we've seen a lot of progress on great policies passed at the state level, things like
Mm-hmm.
even healthcare for all, and that includes undocumented people in California, or sanctuary policies that help stop deportations and limit the collaboration between ICE and police. But then at the same time, well, those things are happening in places like Illinois, California, Oregon, New York, etc. We're seeing the opposite happen, where Texas and Florida in particular are really leading the
Mm-hmm.
charge on criminalization of undocumented people, busing migrants to democratic cities. And so, I think, unfortunately, I think the issue is only going to become more politicized. And we've been
Mm-hmm.
seeing that since 2015, since Trump came on the scene. The refugee issue has always been traditionally very supported by both parties.
Mm-hmm.
And now we're seeing that the Trump administration will want to shut down the refugee program. So I think we have a lot of challenges. It does, in some regards, feel like there are more challenges, but in
Mm-hmm.
other areas, we've made tremendous progress. I think education is another one of those
Mm-hmm.
sustainability goals. We're seeing that globally we're able to educate more people and more young girls. So there's it is a very mix of, a lot of greater challenges and also a lot of improvements towards
Mm-hmm.
human rights and towards equity.
No, I really appreciate what you just shared, Noel. I mean, when was that? 2 days ago, I think now we are both at the Ecumenical Advocacy Days, and what we discussed there is, unfortunately, the problems, the different crises that are going on, they don't have a simple solution. They're very complex.
Mm.
It's not black and white, right? Or
Yeah,
you try to solve, you think you're making progress on one piece, but it's connected with something else. So there's a lot of negotiation. There is a lot of trying to dig deeper because there are different layers, root causes. How is it? And you think you have identified the root cause, but it might be much bigger than that. So I think you alluded to that. So that's really important for our listeners to understand. The other part is because I have also many people from outside the U.S. and people think, oh, the U.S. is this or the U.S. is that, and there are very different responses depending on the state or even within states how certain counties react. So I appreciate you explaining that in this state we have made progress and others not. So it's not easy. I before we go to a couple of questions that I always ask, because this is a spin-off of my 100-mile walk, is because I know that you were really active during the times where especially the undocumented and the children were being chased, and we are um, we are kind of afraid that that might happen in the future again, right? And it's known as the sanctuary movement. Can you maybe, for people who are not familiar with that, what is that movement? And, what did you do and what are you trying to do now to avoid it, that we don't get into that situation again?
yeah, definitely. Thanks for asking that question. Well, and I do think that this is the answer to my 100-mile question.
Mm-hmm.
And for me as a parent of young children too, I really feel like, I feel this issue even more around family
Mm.
unity. family reunification, that the idea of your children being ripped away from you is so horrific. And the fact that this could be a government policy, I mean, it's so inhumane. And really, the roots of the sanctuary movement are, as I mentioned before, in the 1980s Civil War. A lot of um, people were fleeing the death squads, particularly in El Salvador, and coming north to try to find refuge. And they were getting apprehended and deported really back to death squads. And so some of the congregations had already been involved in trying to advocate to stop those civil wars and the U.S. role in those. Maybe you've heard of the School of Americas and the military training the U.S. was doing in Central America. And so they started a network of congregations at the time, around 500 congregations, that were really helping bring, and sometimes even helping people cross the border, but helping them get resettled. They were staying in churches. And Southside Presbyterian in Tucson, where John Fife was at the time, and the current pastor, Allison Harrington, is also very involved in this work. He told me there was about 14,000 migrants that came through that church. A lot of people sleeping on the floor while they were passing through. And so, when we saw in this increase in enforcement, really in Bush, but also in the Obama years, there was this, and then of course into the Trump years, even more so, this increased enforcement and deportations. We really worked to try to stop those deportations. And one of the things we talk about is like prophetic witness and ethical spectacle. So what kind of dramatic tension can we create? And people, undocumented people were coming to congregations and saying, help me stop my deportation. I don't want to be separated from my family. And so we created a model that really was about, the church standing between ICE and immigration customs enforcement and that person facing deportation. And so they would actually live in a church. And we had, in the Bush and Obama years, is when I first got involved as a seminary student in 2007. There was relative success. Different cases, we got stays of removal, deferred action is called. So sort of like a temporary status almost for people, in a relatively short amount of time, some of the time, like 6 months, a year. And then in the Trump administration, people were just having to stay in churches for like 3 or 4 years, which is just really hard on people and the church too. And so I think in those, we had about 1,200 congregations participating. And not all of them were hosting people. There's only a certain amount of public cases, because then people have to be willing to tell their story publicly. So there's only about 50 public cases in the days of the Trump years, Trump 1.0. And but we also saw that people really rose up during the family separation policy that the Trump administration had at the border. And so there was lots of actions and lots of faith communities going out and hitting the streets around that. And with threats of raids, people said, well, we'll open our church doors to allow people in. And I think there was a fair amount of fatigue, compassion fatigue, and burnout and at the end of those Trump years from all of the work. And so really, though, they did shift to asylum accompaniment. So now we've seen a huge uptick in asylum seekers. And the good news there is they have time. They can get work permits. They are in a sort of limbo status while they wait for their cases to go to court, which could take a year or 2 or 3 years. But the difficulty is it does take a while to get that work permit. And so a lot of congregations have been doing that accompaniment work with asylum seekers. A lot of them are also now doing co-sponsorship work for refugees. I think there's a lot of concern about what would new Trump administration
Mm.
do? They dismantle the refugee administration. They promised to do that. They've also promised to do mass deportations. And so I think we're in a difficult moment because I think that we realize that people don't really want to live in a church for that long. And so then we have to ask ourselves, well, what, part of that theory was that ICE won't go into churches because they're called sensitive locations.
Mhm.
So really we're trying to figure out, well, what would we do differently? And I think we're having a lot of conversations about how do we do this, keep doing this work in a new creative ways where we still are showing that prophetic
Mhm.
witness from people of faith. And I think it's very difficult because not just in the faith community, but I think in the social movement space, between the pandemic and the Trump years, and now the emphasis on Palestine, Israel, and what's happening there. There was the Black Lives Matters movement. There's a lot of
Mhm.
trauma that social movement space has been through, and it's hard to keep up the momentum,
Mhm.
and it's going to be difficult to see the impact, what the impact of a potential Trump administration would do. On the contrary, a Biden administration would be a lot less harsh, but they are also doing a lot of anti-immigrant policies, and I think that there is a lot of dissatisfaction with this administration, and you know how do we continue to keep up the momentum to shift the policies in either administration?
Mhm. Before we go to a couple of rapid fire type of questions, a question that I often hear is, okay, we are supportive of people if they have to flee their countries, but they should come to this country with with the right papers. So if they are undocumented, they should be sent back. I know it's complex, but do you have a short answer in terms of, this is why?
Yeah, I mean the real basic answer is that people who come to seek asylum, which actually is a proper way to come, a
Hmm.
legal way to come, or people who decide, who previously didn't, maybe they didn't have an asylum case that was viable, people who come undocumented. I think it's the choice, and having spoken to probably thousands of migrants on both sides of the border, um, it does always come back to a very simple question for we can even ask ourselves, and particularly those of us who might be parents. If you are faced in a scenario where your life is at risk, of course, your kids' life are at risk, or you're faced in an extreme poverty situation where you can't pay for the books of your kids or the uniforms or have them be able to even go to school, or where they might end up being on the street selling gum, or worse, find now is really being inducted or kidnapped into
Hmm.
these gangs. A lot of young women are being forced into relationships with gang members and sexually abused. If you're in a situation where your family is facing these types of obstacles and you don't have a choice really to stay, then I'm sure I would do, and I think most people would do the same thing,
Hmm.
is to try to find a safe space for your family, for your kids. And I mean, the other piece of the puzzle here is just to know a little bit about the immigration system, which unfortunately I think most people don't know at all, hardly anything about our immigration laws. And part of it is that, like a lot of people, for example, in Latin America, there is no line to get in. There's no back of the line to get in. There's just the quota system for family immigration, it would take 20, 30 years There is, and that depend. You'd have to have a relative sponsor you. There's the work visa, like there's a farm visa, but it's you can't take your family. There's a farm worker visa H-2A and a few other work visas, but those are take a lot. They're very complicated. Like you can imagine if a lot of farm workers or construction workers, day laborers have a fifth grade education. How do they fill out this paperwork without some access to resources? And so really that is how people end up coming in a non-regulated way. And then, of course, people are waiting for years in refugee camps. Only what is it, half of 1% of refugee communities are actually resettled. And so, I do think there is a dynamic there about people who go through that process. A lot of those people now are who would traditionally wait in camps are starting to say, well, maybe I'll come and try to claim asylum because it's going to take so long for me to be resettled. And so, our asylum laws, the 1980 Refugee Act, exist for a reason. They exist for this reason, that people facing persecution, facing political persecution, but also facing extreme violence that are now, I think, akin in this moment in time, akin to persecution, that they might have safe refuge somewhere. And that's something we should really be proud of as a country. And, understand a lot of the people who are here undocumented have been working, building our houses and building the roads. And like the people that were workers that on the Baltimore Bridge that collapsed. And people are giving they're paying taxes that they're paying in Social Security they may never get back. And those people do deserve rights. And if it wasn't for some of these 1996 laws, the 3 and 10 year bar, they could adjust status through a family member. But unfortunately, our legal system says, oh no, you have to go back because you were in the country undocumented. You have to go back to your own country and wait. Probably it'll be 10 years. Well, that's not a viable option for people. They're sending money back home, supporting family members. They're trying to send their kids to a better education than they had here in the U.S. And so, yes, there has to be some level of regulation. I understand people, one of people's complaints, well, we want to know who's in the country. I think all the advocates would agree that there has to be a orderly, systematic way of having an immigration system. But we also have to provide the funds to make that system work. And the type of restrictionist policies that we've created, including some of those 1996 laws, but also the type of laws we're seeing proposed even on both sides of the party now, which are very anti-immigrant, those types of solutions aren't going to get us where we need to be. If you can create more laws against immigrants, that won't keep people who need to flee because their life or their children's lives are at risk. That will not stop the migration flow, and it's just going to make things worse for all of us.
No, thanks, Noel. I mean, it's really helpful, very insightful. We'll make sure also that, both for the work that you're doing as part of the UCC grassroots work and the CWS work, we will have links and people can find it in the podcast notes and find out more information and how they can also be active in this work as well as a volunteer and as a supporter. There are many ways that we can all do our bit. You mentioned already the reason for which cause you would walk 100 miles, but that when I do these 100-mile walks, so 5 days to 6 days in a week, 15, 20 to 20 miles per day, I'm often accompanied by other people. And then we talk about why are we on earth? What drives you? And then we often talk about religion and spirituality. And one question that fascinates me is the discussion about what is happening with the younger generation. Are they, some people say they are not religious anymore, but they're spiritual. Others are saying, yes, they're still religious, but they express it all only different. My question to you, and I know it's complex, but again, short answer. What do you see happening among youth in your community around that topic?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that concerns us all. I know certainly it's a hot topic in all of the different congregation life
Hmm.
and denominations. And um, I think, I'm seeing some different things happening. I'm not sure there's a monolith about what's happening with youth right now, but I am seeing like there's these passion for justice issues
Mm.
around Black Lives Matters, around climate action, around reproductive rights, around uh, trying to stop the war in Palestine. And so I'm seeing like a real, that there is a real spark of hope to try to fight for a better world. And I think that for some people, that is connecting dots to their religious background or their parents' religious background, and also to who they are as a spiritual person, because I believe we're all spiritual people in one way or another. And so I do think, though, that the younger generation is having a harder time connecting with some of the traditions of old. So, I mean, let's just take going to church and, listening to some stories, some sermons, some songs, sing-alongs, hymns, and whatnot. That seems to be harder for these younger people than it was even in my generation. And I'm still trying to figure out exactly what that's related to. I think that there is something happening around social media and the amount of screen time and video games that all these kids are doing. Having been a youth pastor, I felt at times that I had to compete with that. But at the same time, it does seem to really depend on the user there. Some people are really utilizing those tools for the good. And I had when I was a youth pastor, I had a group that started a P flag in their high school, and I'm forgetting the acronym right now, but it's to try to create awareness and allyship around
Hmm.
LGBTQ issues, and that was in a more conservative region. And they were using social media for that type of thing. And so the young people more than myself even understand how to use the tools. We've seen this in different things with BLM and the Palestinian protests right now on college campuses. But there's also, there's a lot of tensions around that. There's a lot of different perspectives around it. I think one of the things that's hardest for our culture now, I think now just across generations, is that the capitalist influence around materialism and productivity and class. I think that dissuades us at this point, not only from being involved in religious society, but from being involved in civic society. And so I think we've seen a breakdown really of our civic societal institutions, whether it be, the privatization of our school system, trying to no longer have any unions. I think that the community that we see locally isn't the same as it used to be, where people don't know each other in their community. And so there's almost a sense of alienation, and to some degree or another, I think the pandemic really exacerbated all those things. And when it comes to church, Christian church attendance, definitely it's seen a big drop since the pandemic. And whereas, again, Zoom and technology is a blessing in many ways, it also, has, I think, dissuaded more in-person activity. And that was a savior when it came to needing to communicate during a pandemic. And now it's also, been hard for people to figure out, how do we live in this new world? How do we balance? How do we still build the community at an in-person level rather than behind our screens all the time?
Mm.
So I think there is a lot of hope. I think more and more young people care about climate action because they realize they have to.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's different even from when I was a youth some 20 years ago, that we were talking about recycling, we were talking about environmental issues and the different pollution that affected us and our health. But I don't think we realized that our future literally depended on climate action. And I think the young people do now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe that's something for the church to look at. If you really want to engage with the younger generation, you need to do more around that particular ask and that particular need. Okay, I'm
Yeah.
going to accelerate you.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm
No,
taking too
no.
long. I'll try to go quicker.
We're talking about singing, and so
Yeah.
I always questions about music as well. If I ask you to come up with a song or a piece of music that best embodies who you are, what you are about, which song or piece of music would you share?
Yeah. That's always a tough question because how
Hmm.
do you break it down to one? But I think one song I mentioned to you on a different call, that
Yeah.
Woody Guthrie song, Deportee. I think about the flight of migrant workers that crashed, one of the biggest crashes in
Hmm.
California history. And they didn't know the names of the people. They just called
Hmm.
them deportees, 28 people. And I think that we are really finding ourselves in this same moment where the dehumanization of migrants, but also the dehumanization of people in general who are on the margins is on the rise and continues to be so. And I think that raising the awareness through art, through music, is really important. And to a certain degree, like although I'm not a migrant, I'm not an immigrant, but I've always felt a relationship with, and I think at a spiritual level too, is like all of us have at one point or another been the stranger. And what does it mean, uh, when you're welcome, when you've been welcomed before? Shouldn't we also then extend our arms?
Um, I hope that with this podcast I'm able to connect more people with each other. I connect you with the listeners. I also try to connect you with the previous guests. So I always ask my guests to come up with a question for the next guest. So my previous guest has the following question for you.
What would you be willing to die for? We used to have people who were so committed to a cause that if it took their life, it would be okay.
Well, I mean, I'm sure many parents would answer the same way as a newer parent who has two small children. Definitely, like, my children ring true, but I think it's also what they embody, right? Like, they
Mm,
embody a generation that's going to be fighting against climate change. They're mixed race children, so they're going to be there's a lot more,
mm,
I think a much larger increase of mixed race children. But what will that be like for them and their struggle for equity? And I think it comes back to that family unity question. Like, how can we bring families together and not tear them apart? And um, so, I think that's the hill I'll choose to die on.
Mm-hmm. Your question for the next guest.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess I think about a lot about social movement spaces that I'm in, and I always see the need for spiritual growth in those spaces. I believe that the original religion and spirituality is part of what fuels social movement. And so I think my question would be like, how do you see faith or spirituality as an important part of social movement work?
Okay. I would like to, as my final question, go back to the Sustainable Development Goals that you mentioned earlier. Yes, you're right. Some progress has been made on a couple of those goals, but on average, we are at 15%. And those goals that we set need to be reached before 2030. Now, a growing group of people around the world said, one of the reasons that we are not making the progress as we should, do, should, should be doing, is that we are not paying proper attention to the abilities, skills, and knowledge that we need as an individual and as a community to work on those process changes and system changes. And they did a survey and they came up with 5 inner development goals that we need to work on as individuals and as a community. And those 5 goals are being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. So I just want to have a quick reaction. Had you heard about the inner development goals? And if yes, if not, yeah, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, actually, I hadn't heard of those yet. So thank you for sharing those. I'd love to read more about those. And no, I think the one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, there's a lot of talk in our work about burnout, about self-care, and you named being. And I fear that sometimes we're so busy or we've created so much business for ourselves. And then when we're not busy, we tend to just pick up our phones and read the news or play a board game or whatever it is we do on our phones and social media. And, I fear we're losing those moments where we just be, where we just think, where we just check in with who we are, where we are in life, where we just watch the wind in the trees or take a walk and think about where we are at in life and where we want to go. But also sometimes just sometimes I try to like not have a thought process or a
Mm,
goal for my the few moments I get by myself, but just to be. And I think that if more people had the space and place and safety to have those moments to just be, that we could come up with a lot more creative ways to address all of these other goals that you've listed out.
mm, mm,
And um, there's something about the experience here on this earth and in our earthly bodies that we lose if we're constantly distracting ourselves. And so, I'm trying to work on that, and I think
mm,
it's a space that we all need a little bit more of.
mm. No, thanks for sharing that, Noel. And I think a lot of people that are concerned about this Earth, I mean, we have crossed already 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries. Many of them are saying, we should do less. I mean, one of the reasons that we are in this mess is because of the growth paradigm, and especially in the Western countries. So we should be learning to do less. And then, I think the key is being and just be. And, like all the other muscles that we have to train, that's also something that you can train. So to look at yourself. And I do think that faith and spirituality can play a very important role. So, something to think about. Thank you so much for your willingness to talk with me today, and all the best with all the great work that you do. And
and thank you so much for the invitation and for the work that you do with this podcast. It's very cool to. I've been listening to some of your other ones, and I think it's a lot more. It's a lot different, more different than other podcasts, and the type of material that we're interfacing with, and definitely helps that you also have many different voices from different expertise, and it helps us cross over and learn from each other, and it's definitely a really useful tool. So thank you for this work. And
thank you for saying that. I'm going to use that as my promo. So no, but it's absolutely also for me great. As you know, I've talked to jazz musicians, NGO workers, of course, a lot.
Yeah.
But it's I really learn a lot from it. Now it's awesome. Thanks. Thank you so much, and all the best.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.